Hello and welcome to yet another webinar. We are back this Saturday, and today we are going to discuss about how teachers can adapt to the competency-based assessment framework. This webinar, the ideation for this webinar actually happened in one of our previous webinars where we discussed about competency-based teaching and learning specifically for math. And one of our panelists pointed out that teacher training is a crucial aspect to implement competency-based assessment. Now, where do we stand with CBA? There are various schools. There are various types of schools in India. There are international schools. There are state board schools. There are CBSE schools. So it is going to differ across boards, but there is an intent to move from rote learning to competency-based learning with the onset and rollout of NEP. We have a fantastic panel today. We have Mr. Sultan Ahmed, who is the chairperson of the Association of International Schools of India. We have Mr. Sumit Mehta, who is the founder of Lead Group. We have Mr. Niranjan Aradhyay, who is a development educationist, and we have Ms. Aanchal Chomal, who is a professor at Azim Premji University. And to begin with, before we get into the nitty-gritties of the topic, I would like our panelists to give some opening remarks on, where do different boards stand when it comes to the implementation of what stage are they at when it comes to the implementation of CBA, and what does it broadly mean for a teacher to move from rote-based learning or rote-based teaching to CBA. Achal ma'am, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure, Ravina. So, very good evening to everybody, all the audience, and to my co-panelists. It is indeed a very critical topic for discussion, and perhaps at the outset, I would like to say two, three things. One is that we should not misunderstand competency-based assessment as a change in the scheme of evaluation or some sort of a new pattern of question paper designing alone. When we talk about competency based assessment, we are talking about a fundamental shift in the way we do education. It goes to the core of why we teach and what we teach. So, to begin with, I must say that there can be no CBA possible unless we ask ourselves this critical question: why we teach and how do we approach teaching learning processes in our schools. Added to that, I would also say that, therefore, the question on CBA is not only relevant for teachers, it's equally relevant for all other stakeholders in education. So, whether you're a teacher educator, whether you're a policy maker, whether you're a parent, I think each one of us needs to engage in a discourse around competency based education and competency based assessment. And the third and the last point I would like to make is that the new education policy and the national curriculum framework for foundational stage and school education, which gives a lot of impetus to competency-based education, is meant for all the 250 million school-going children in India. So when we are talking about CPA or we are talking about CBE, we are not restricting to any particular board, state or central, private or international or government, right? We are talking about making education meaningful for every child who goes to schools in India.
Thank you so much, ma'am. What ma'am said is also of significance that, it basically tries to touch upon the point that what are we doing? What do we mean when we say that we are learning? So CBA tries to emphasize on CBA tries to emphasize on the fact that whatever you have learned, you're able to apply it to your real life, apart uh, as opposed to rote-based learning where you just learn for examinations. Um, Sultan sir, would you like to pitch in?
Yes, good evening, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here and an honor to speak with such lovely panelists. Hi, Aanchal and Azim. Sunit, pleasure to be here. I think the fundamental question is we're so obsessed with what the child remembers. And I think that's precisely what all our examination systems seem to be revolving around. We're not looking at how the child is learning, right? And what can the child do with what they have learned, and what the skills that they've acquired. I think this is where the emphasis has to focus on. And we've spoken enough. We've even built a beautiful policy, the the NEP 2020. I think the challenge is who's going to bell the cat. And across boards, there are certain movements that I see. You do have CBSE and ICSE that have initiated. They now talk about question bank reforms and sample questions, and we're still talking about the same thing, which is again assessing the how the child remembers. International boards by nature, already focus on the CBA principles of being very inquiry driven, skill based, and application oriented. No wonder a lot of parents today aspire to have their children in international education. But for some strange reason, we've kept it quite elitist and it's out of purview for a middle class. I think we need to pick up some of these best practices and see them implemented across segments, not just the national boards, but even at the state boards. And the biggest change maker that needs to stand up and put their hands up to make CBA a reality is the teacher. And we're still talking about content coverage. Uh, Even today, no matter who talks to a school, no matter what segment of school, you'll always hear this that they don't have enough time to complete their syllabus, which again, we're talking about content, right? Teachers need to move from being the information deliverers to being those architects where children are going through a process where the skills are being honed rather than their memory is being tested. So I think the shift in conversation has happened, but apart from a handful of Indian schools and genuinely a lot of the international schools, I don't see it in the masses. And I think that's where the challenge lies today. As we progress this conversation, would love to talk about how this can happen and what can be done on the ground.
Thank you, Sultan sir. Sumit sir, would you like to pitch in?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. Ravina, you asked what is the current status, and I must say that for CBSE and state board schools in the country, the status is that we are at a very low level of readiness to move to this system. And like Anchal said, this is not a small assessment system change. It is actually a big change in how we teach and how we learn. And in currently, if you look at in India, we have the habits of decades of rote learning, which is currently present in most CBSE and state board schools and ICSE schools. And the system is seeped in teachers essentially predicting what questions will come in the exams and dictating the answers to those questions to students, and students mugging up the answers to those questions. And all of us are swimming in this illusion of learning. And competence-based assessments actually brings a marked shift in that kind of illusion of learning to really shifting to real learning. Now, you also said what it means for a teacher to move from rote-based assessments to CBA. I think the single biggest shift is that teachers have to move from teaching content to using content to teach skills. Currently, if you look at it, let's take an example of a language teacher. A lot of focus is in teaching the stories, teaching the fiction or non-fiction text, and then answering the chapter back questions. However, with competence-based assessments, they will need to move to teaching skills like the literal, inferential, and evaluative skills of language. Similarly for math, science, and social studies. So that's the single biggest shift in teaching, how teachers move from just teaching content and, like Sultan said, covering syllabus, to using that content to actually teach skills which are going to be useful in answering competence-based assessments. And that's the big shift that all of us have to undertake.
Yeah, that is an excellent point. Where teachers should not be in the classroom to teach or deliver content, but to impart some skills. Niranjan Aradhya, sir.
Yeah, thank you very much, and good evening to all. I just want to, kind of place on record that we are in the age where we have too much obsession for this assessment and testing, without really, kind of understanding the best interest of the child. Probably the first step towards, kind of making this entire CBA, the competency-based assessment, more meaningful and child-friendly, we need to understand the kind of normative framework that is available, respecting the dignity of the children, and also kind of the kind of education that what we are imparting. So that is available both in the international instruments, and also more importantly in the Constitution of India, and the Right to Education Act. Particularly, I'm talking about the Right to Education Act. What exactly we mean when we say kind of assessment or testing. And one more issue, like one more fear that I like basically that what I've been observing from last more a kind of a decade. Too much of centralization in testing is very dangerous. I think, in my opinion, testing should be decentralized, and the best kind of way to test children is at the school level. And we should give that kind of an autonomy, particularly to empower teachers autonomy, empowering teachers to test children at the school level, and certainly to take any correction measures if necessary, to make them to achieve the minimum competencies what is really kind of need to be defined under the Right to Education Act, particularly rules 23 as amended in 2017. So therefore, I think probably what is the first step towards bringing CBA into reality is basically to understand this normative framework in the larger interest of the child, rather than kind of just kind of equating with either kind of encouraging more marks, or a kind of rote learning process. So in my opinion, the first step is to understand the best interest of the child. Number two, understand the normative framework. Then the third is, of course, for me in Karnataka, this competency-based assessment is not a new thing. More or less, the Karnataka state is following this competency-based assessment quite from long time. So how do we really identify the competencies under each subject, and what kind of design that we evolve for kind of learning process, and how do we test this, and how do we really address the gap, if any, is really the fundamental questions that we need to understand and debate at this point. If necessary, we'll come back later.
Thank you, sir, for your opening remarks. I think one point that we touched upon during the opening remarks was that teachers, no matter which teacher you approach, irrespective of the board, they have this anxiety or fear that they have a certain amount of syllabus to deliver within a certain amount of time frame, and that doesn't necessarily allow them to experiment in the classroom. Now, how does a classroom look like? There have been traditional notions, you want, it is considered a good classroom if there is no noise coming out of it. But if you're learning a language and there is no noise coming out of it, are you learning the language? So there are a lot of these notions of how a teacher is supposed to go about the day, finish the syllabus in time for exams, etc. So when all of these exterior factors are involved in such, how do they need to change so we can support teachers? How do timetables change, for example, or how does support from their peers change? Or and also, does it take more time to plan for a competency based assessment or a competency based class? um, any of you?
Yeah, I can perhaps share some thoughts on that. Um, yeah, so see, Ravina, we need to understand what do we mean by competencies, and like you rightly said that we have all this content which is provided in our textbooks, and when we're talking about competency-based education, we are talking about what is the child able to do with this content. So you've learned about, say, a particular dynasty in history. Now, what are you able to do with that content? Can you reflect upon the kind of architecture this dynasty promoted? Can you reflect upon what kind of changes it brought in its society? Can you connect it back to a dynasty that you may have studied in another century? Can you compare and contrast? So when we're talking about competencies, we are talking about certain kind of learning achievements that don't develop in a particular period or even in a particular grade. The way the entire competencies in school education have been conceptualized in the national curriculum framework is that it is rooted in the curricular aims of a subject. So, if you're talking about language education, as my fellow panelist spoke about, he gave a very good example that when you're talking about language education, you're operating out of certain curricular aims. Why you're teaching language? Is it only about effective communication, or is it about building the aesthetics of language? Is it about appreciating that we are a multilingual country? Okay, so unless you do not understand the curricular aims and then you try to look at the stage at which you are teaching. So if you are a preparatory stage teacher teaching at grades 3, 4 and 5, then again the national curriculum framework provides you with certain curricular goals, that to what end do you need to take your language education towards, right? um, Once you look at the curricular goals, you then look at the competencies, that to be able to converse fluently, perhaps to be able to engage with different kinds of text, whether it's narrative, persuasive, descriptive, right? And only after you've understood the competencies for grades 3, 4 and 5 will you be able to do something meaningful at grade 3, which is articulated in the form of what we call as learning outcomes. Unless the teacher has an entire roadmap of this curricular aim, curricular goal, competency, and learning outcomes, it's very difficult to imagine us doing something different in the classroom when it comes to a 40-minute period. So, one of the first things, a precursor to looking at a timetable or a precursor to looking at our allocation will be to get this entire pyramid of education right, so that every hour, every minute that you spend in a classroom is purposive. It is geared towards building that sort of competencies, right? So I think at the heart of the matter is getting this broader conceptual framework, and I think this is the normative framework that we are talking about. That education should be made meaningful. Education should be made valuable to every child who's going to school. Now, once these things are done, if there is some sort of an understanding of this, then a lot of things can be done within the 8 hour or the 6 hour that a child has, right? Um, in school, you can look at all the chapters that you are supposed to teach. You can prioritize those chapters. You can see to what end do you want the conversations to go in each chapter. If you're looking at, say, for example, a text in geography, you are not only going to focus on the facts of, say, if you're teaching physiographic divisions of India, you're not going to just focus on what is the extent of the Himalayas or what is the extent of the Indo-Gangetic Plain. You're going to talk about how the Himalayas or how the Indo-Gangetic plains have influenced the environment in that region, right? You're going to talk about how it has transformed the society. You're going to talk about very many things. How does it compare with similar mountain ranges or similar coastal plains or riverine plains across the country? So you're going to then start teaching your content towards those competencies, right? And the only way that shift is going to happen is when you have this entire roadmap very clear conceptually in your mind. Hmm?
If I could just build on what Anshul said, ultimately the change that it's not that teachers have to do more with competency-based assessments. It is that teachers have to do different, because the shift that we are asking for is, earlier the focus was on what the students learn and what the students know. Now the shift is going to be on how the students think about that topic and what the students can do with what they have learned. That's really what competence is, right? What you can, how do you think about it, and what you can do with those things. So if I just take the example of Himalayas that Anshul said, the idea is that currently our whole focus when we teach is to get students to learn the features of Himalayas or of the desert or of the Gangetic plains. However, when we move to competency based assessments, the focus would shift to getting students to think about how do geographical features affect the culture, the history, and the economics of a region. Now that's a thinking skill which is in the realm of competence, and that's a shift from knowledge to competence that these assessments are designed to encourage. So what it means for a teacher is, when you are designing a lesson plan, the objective of the lesson plan, when you write, the learning outcome is not that students will know the features of Himalayas. The learning outcome will change to students will be able to articulate how geographical features impact the economy, history, and culture of a society. And when that is the learning objective of a lesson plan, the way you would design the lesson plan would become different. The resources you would use would be different. The questions you would ask would be different, and therefore the assessment that you will then administer would be different. And you won't stop at the assessment. The most important part of teaching is, once you have generated a student response from assessment, how do you give feedback to that student? Currently, teachers, when they give feedback, they correct the answers as right or wrong, or they check for spelling mistakes. This will shift to teachers actually giving one-on-one feedback on, was the student able to make connections? Was the student able to make an inference? Was the student able to support their assertion with evidence? That kind of feedback is very different from the current level of feedback. So I'm giving specific examples to just bring to life the shifts in teaching, assessment, and remedials that teachers will have to undergo as we shift from rote learning to competence based assessments.
Uh, Ravin, I'm
I
just
have
adding in here and building on Sumit and Anchal's perspectives. For me, over years, almost 2 decades of having worked with schools and very closely with school teachers, I've always found the sport teachers to be among the wisest, because what they actually do is competency based assessment, right? There's very little theory of the sport field. There's a lot of skill development that's happening, specific inputs given on what areas of the skill that needs to be developed. And different children are at different levels of development. Not every child in the class plays the same sport at the same level, and the sport instructor gets it, and the children also get it. Very clearly in a classroom, the child knows who is better at fielding, who's better at taking catches, or who's better off at being behind the wickets if it is a cricket sport, right? So another important challenge here is that if we give too much focus to the assessment, that means you're then evaluating a child on the match that he plays. So I think that's where we need to draw a line and be very clear that when it comes to competencies, and what kind of competencies are we talking about? We're talking about competencies like critical thinking or problem solving. We're talking about creativity and innovation or collaboration or communication. And these are competencies that take a lifetime to develop, right? What we need to ensure is, are children on that path of learning? Are they learning how to learn? Right? Let me give you an example of communication. A lot of times, because I've worked in the space of life skills all my life, I realized that, communication for a 5, 6 year old is about, can I communicate an issue like a good touch or a bad touch? When I'm 8 and 9, can I stand up to somebody who is bullying me? Maybe when I'm 10 and 11, can I voice uh, my, displeasure when I see something wrong happening? Maybe in grade 10, I want to talk to my parents about my career choices. The issues vary, but the skill remains the same, which is broadly communication skills. I think the fundamental understanding of competencies itself is quite fragile, if I may use that word. But the best person for you to pick up and learn about competencies is walk into the sports field. The sports teacher is already doing it. But how do you bring that and bring it into a classroom and convert a cricket into a physics and a football into a math, and then look at children playing rather than all children mugging up for an exam? I think there's a fundamental shift that needs to happen. And I'm going to end here with a massive bottleneck that remains in our country, no matter what conversations we have about competencies and competency based assessment. The biggest bottleneck in our country remains the admissions to universities. And we still are looking at rote based exams where we are teaching children tricks and tips and we use the word very proudly, cracking these exams. I think that's one big bottleneck, and it has to be at the central government level, because the universities are guided more by the, the Ministry of Education at the UGC level. Unless we change and shift how we are evaluating a child to come into those universities, we will continue, no matter how many changes, eventually they will have to do a rote-based exam. Thankfully, we do see a lot of movement. There are a lot of new age universities that are, admitting children today on the basis of their competencies. So the more we see that change, the more we will see the change happening in the school. And in the school, we need to fundamentally shift the way we look at teaching and learning, more from an academic lens that we presently wearing to more of a game and a sport. Those lenses give us a little better idea of how competencies need to be looked at and evolved and supported in a school environment.
I just want to look at these from a different perspective altogether. In the sense, when I say different perspective, particularly, for me, I'm a great admirer of NCF 2005. When we talk about competency-based assessment, in fact, competency-based learning is also equally important. You can do assessment, competency-based assessment only when you kind of adopt competency-based teaching learning process. That is where exactly the NCF, has made a kind of a paradigm shift in understanding the construction of knowledge itself, what we call the constructive approach. So therefore, I think the entire approach in the classroom need to be changed. How do we really make our classroom more democratic, more dialogue, more kind of exchange of kind of ideas, thoughts, and other things, which itself is an empowering process for competency based learning process. Because usually in education, fundamentally we always kind of place education under four important questions, like why to teach, what to teach, and how to teach, did we teach. These are the four common questions that always we ask. Why? Of course, kind of making children to acquire critical thinking, or kind of rational thinking, decision making. All these things is a kind of a long term goal. So therefore, see, the entire approach in the classroom, particularly moving from rote memorization to competency based learning process, is very crucial. And how do we really empower and handhold our teachers to make this shift in the first place is really an important question that we need to address. Of course, I said normative framework. Normative framework is also defined in the Right to Education Act. Particularly because of the time constraint, I may not be able to go through all the details of that. Particularly, we need to see Section 29. How Section 29 has completely redefined the learning process itself. What should be the basis of learning process, and how do we really create that kind of a classroom is really something very important. And second thing is, probably we can start with what is defined in Rule 23 of the Right to Education Act, that we, as a first step towards competency based assessment, what we need to do is we have to prepare class wise, subject wise competencies that need to be achieved, which is very, very important. Once if we are clear, once we have clarity about this is what we want to achieve at the end of our kind of learning process, then designing a kind of an assessment based on the best interests of the child becomes somewhat very easy. Of course, again, this assessment, as I told, is not really centrally guided or centrally, kind of monitored assessment. I think we need to empower our teachers. Of course, we always say that continuous professional development for teacher, even for assessment, is part of that continuous professional development. So what I just want to say, probably using this normative framework, understanding this normative framework given in a larger kind of context, both in RTE and RTE rules, and making our teachers, making our managements, making our policy makers aware of it becomes a very crucial step towards kind of moving towards competency based learning process as well as competency based assessment process.
Thank you so much. We have received diverse answers on this one particular question. Moving on, I have a small announcement for our viewers. There are a lot of questions coming in, and those who ask the three best questions, you will receive a free subscription to the Hindu Online. So keep them coming. First, I would like to take a question from Mr. KK Murthy. Uh, is there not a need to assess the competency of state board teachers in government schools initially before competency based assessment of students? Achal ma'am?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Ravina and Mr. Murthy. You see, I must share this that across states in India, there's a lot of effort that's happening at two fronts. One is to understand, and this is not new effort. See, we must not forget that the shift to competency based education has been in our country for the last 30, 40 years. Like Mr. Niranjan also shared, and many of my other panelists shared that, and some of you who have been engaging in Indian policy documents, you know that it was after the 1986 policy when the minimum levels of learning were crafted that we first started talking about competencies. Again, in 2000, in the Yashpal Committee report of Learning Without Burden, the NCF 2005, and now the recent NCS of Foundational and School Education, we are again talking about competency-based assessments, right? So we have to see this as part of a continuum. That's the first thing. And therefore, I must say that state boards, central boards have been doing a lot of effort in earnest to help their teachers understand some of these things. But we should have, so illustratively, if I could share with you some examples that, and I'll base it on the work that Azim Premji University does. So we have a massive presence in northeastern states of India, and four boards, particularly Assam board, Mizoram board, Meghalaya board, and Tripura board, have been for the last 2 to 3 years conducting systematic capacity building programs for secondary and senior secondary teachers to write up to district level examination committees on how to understand competencies, how to understand learning outcomes, how to design competency based questions, how to also reflect on their pedagogical approaches. And a culmination of this has been like one of my panelists shared in the form of item banks, question banks, because just talking theoretically is not going to help. You also have to see that if you have to transition from a question which is rote memorization based on the Himalayas of India, what should it look like, right? So what kind of data do you need to present, or what kind of facts or evidences do you need to present to the student so that they can understand and interpret perhaps the Himalaya as a geographical feature in a slightly different way and look at its connection with the environment, with its the society, with politics and everything else, right? So across the boards in Northeast India, a lot of work is happening. Similarly, if I talk about the central board, the CBSE, with whom we work very closely, every year there are close to 100 teachers who undergo a 3 month long certificate program in test development. And these teachers are trained on a rigorous methodologies of how to create valid, reliable, fair assessment tools. And later a lot of these teachers are empaneled, or perhaps they contribute to making these kind of systemic efforts on the ground. Similarly, the Council of Indian School Certificate Examination, CISE board, they have started workshops for the middle stage teachers. So we have been working very closely with middle stage teachers of CISE and ICSE board schools, ICSE and IC board schools across India, that they want to understand what kind of transformative pedagogy is needed. So I think not all the state boards and even private boards are really investing a lot of time, attention to making this transition happen. But we should at no point forget, the point that was being made earlier, that we are talking about a mindset change. If a parent continues to be obsessed about whether his or her child has got a 90-95% in an examination, then no matter what the schools do to inculcate values, dispositions, capacities in the form of competencies, ultimately, if it's the report card that's going to matter more than anything else, then all your efforts go down the drain, right? So I think I would say that state board teachers, and having worked across several states of India, I must say that we have a very committed lot of teachers who are really making things work on the ground. State boards are investing a lot in capacity building, but the kind of shift that we are talking about is massive. We have a large system. So we need to see how are we contributing to the shift, right? And we have to be a part of this journey. We have to enable our schools, our teachers, and our children to move towards better education.
I'm just going to add to Anchal's ma'am's points, which was extremely pertinent. Uh, and Mr. KMK Murthy, for your specific question, I have a lot of experience of having worked with government schools in the past. And one of the things I must admit is that the teachers are extremely passionate. Of course, you do find a certain percentage of teachers that are disinterested. But the problem is, eventually, when the Commissioner of Public Instructions or the Education Secretary of the state looks at the state outcome of or performance of the state's education, they're only looking at the 10th grade and the 12th grade exams. For example, in Karnataka, SSLC exams is what defines the quality of our teachers. So no matter what changes the teachers make, if they are not able to achieve those grades at that exam level, they are not able to justify the changes. So the teachers then tend to go back to doing those shortcuts of preparing children and cramming them for an exam. So while the intent is there and a lot of changes happening on the ground, unless we change the format in which our examination system happens, these will be conversations and we can talk till the cows come home. Nothing's going to change on the ground.
Thank you, sir. We have an excellent question by Ms. Anuradha Ganeshan. She says, competency-based reform requires vertical and horizontal alignment. However, in India, textbooks, pedagogy, lesson time, and assessments are often misaligned. What systemic levers beyond teacher training would you prioritize to create coherence so that assignments don't remain the only place where competency shows up? I think Achal ma'am, you mentioned that how all of these needs to be aligned, but she is going beyond it and asking how can we do it?
Yeah, see, we've been talking about this for again, this kind of discourse has been happening that we need to look at pre service teacher education and in service teacher education in a continuum. In fact, in many of the so called countries, progressive countries, which are doing very well educationally, we know that they have a 5-year teacher education program, right? Um, so in India, however, we just have a 2-year teacher education program, and even there, we know that 90% of our teacher education institutions lie in the private sector. There have been enough and more studies to show that many a times B.Ed colleges operate out of rundown shops. So we also have to see how are we preparing our teachers, right? And pre-service teacher education has to give a lot of thrust into these things, right? The curriculum of pre-service, the kind of syllabus that is taught at pre-service, that needs to dramatically, fundamentally shift the kind of practicums that student teachers do, where they actually have to spend time in schools. How closely is it monitored? How closely are teachers being mentored at that point of time so that they are ready for the real world, right? They are ready to face children and they are ready to enable this kind of competency based education in their classrooms, because only when you have prepared teachers well, then these teachers come into the system, and then there are in-service teacher education being provided either by an SCRT or by a diet or by a private institution. Then it makes sense because you're all talking about the same kind of things. So one of the first things which is needed is we have to look at pre-service and in-service teacher education in a continuum. Secondly, the kind of textbooks that we are developing, and there have been a lot of movements around uh, uh, redesigning our textbooks. NCRT published a set of textbooks. State boards are preparing their textbooks. You also have to see that how aligned are these textbooks. We have to constantly see the alignment of these textbooks to the competencies, the learning outcomes that we are talking about. And engaging with these textbooks has to become a critical part of all your teacher education programs. So when in-service teachers come, rather than talking about philosophy and hardcore theoretical things, one has to look at a lesson, say a lesson on electromagnetism, and make it fun. The way Sultan ji was talking about that. How do you convert a physics class into a class of games and things which are exciting? Very recently, we were having a workshop with a group of children from grades 4, and we were doing this fun activity on mathematics where we gave them a set of solutions, and we asked each group to come up with as many problems as they could, which would have that answer as the solution, and it was nothing short of a games period. Similarly, in language, there's so many different kinds of activities that can be designed, which can purposively help in enabling teachers to make that sort of transition in their entire pedagogical approach, right? So your teaching learning materials then have to be viewed in that sort of a way. Your in service has to be in continuity with your pre service. And ultimately, I think the other point that came also, that we also need to measure whether we are going in the right direction by being inside a classroom, not just by looking at the report card of a state or of a school. You actually need to sit inside a classroom, spend a day in a school, and only then will you be able to judge whether things on the ground have changed or not. And let me tell you this based on experience, that a lot has been changing. There are passionate teachers who are doing phenomenal work on the ground in transforming their pedagogy. So I think there are glimpses of all of these things, like Anuradha was talking about, coming together. But like I've been saying, that all of us working in education have to do our part, right? And wherever we feel that missing link, we will need to help in enabling that sort of a missing link.
If I can just add to what Ansel said, I think Anuradha brought up the question of coherence. It's a really important question. The fundamental thing that is required is that we have too much reliance on textbook as the anchor of learning. Uh, and if you look at globally systems which have scored very high on PISA, which is a competence-based assessment, there the anchor of learning is no longer the textbook, but it is the lesson plan, and the lesson plan can bring together different resources, textbook being just one. But you could use activities as a resource, you could use audiovisual as a resource, you could make your own slides. So I think the whole big shift is, we have so much of focus on the content. Textbook is nothing but a repository of content, and we have to shift the focus from content to skill. uh, the second is, again, we spend so much time talking about teacher training, and we work with about 60,000 teachers across the country, 8,500 schools. My big learning has been that teacher training without the enabling tools and resources is actually not very valuable, because teachers come to a training program, they learn interesting concepts, but they don't have either the enabling environment or the enabling resources or the tools to go back and then implement that training into their classrooms. So therefore, each school can think of themselves as the crucible of this change. We don't have to wait for system to reform, we don't have to wait for government to change their textbooks and trainings. Each school can think of, okay, if I have to prepare myself for competence based assessments, how do I change the resources I use, how do I change the way teachers prepare lesson plans, how do I change the resources that I use in the classroom, how do I change assessments, how do I change the process of giving feedback to students. And if you do that as a system wide coherent approach, then you can bring in the change in a school, because one teacher would find it difficult to do it by herself. But if a school decides to be the crucible of that change, then you can bring about the change that is required. It will be a coherent change so that all elements that are involved in the teaching learning process work together to prepare those students for competencies?
No,
I want to add.
probably. Okay. Yeah,
Go
please.
ahead. Please
Yeah.
go ahead.
So, in my opinion, I think probably this cannot be, kind of, we cannot just leave this to the teachers alone. In my opinion, this is more of an institutional change, particularly when it comes to kind of a state education system, particularly the state boards. I personally feel that we need to bring a lot of, kind of far-reaching reforms, both in SARTs as well as in diets, and also at the BRCs at the block level. Because unless you create an institutional mechanisms, to handhold, to support, to kind of help our teachers, to get into this mode, it is very difficult to practice because what our education, particularly teacher education institution, is much said about, in the Verma Committee report of 2013. So therefore, that is one thing, particularly the pre-service, teacher training. The most important thing is when they get into service, what kind of in-service, particularly this continuous professional development, kind of programs, that becomes very, very important. And this is not one time. We can't say that, we have given training on competency based, teaching or assessment. This is not one time. This is a continuous process. So unless we, kind of empower our, academic institutions, particularly SCRTs and, diets, we may not be able to sustain this for a long time. So the sustainability and continuity, and also, kind of strengthening the entire process, depends on, kind of strengthening our own institutional mechanism. So the culture of, competency based learning and competency based assessment need to be institutionalized. And also equally we have to empower our schools, because schools are the operational, sites, basically, that whatever we discuss here, like as experts, finally that has to be operationalized at the school level. So how do we create that kind of an environment, enabling environment, both for, kind of learning as well as assessment, becomes very, very important. And equally important, kind of creating some kind of sensitization awareness among parents, like how the entire process of rote memory or rote, learning process could be shifted to, competency based, more constructive approach. So this is, kind of an interrelated, kind of process, not just it is the burden of teachers. In fact, this is the burden of all personnel who are involved in the education process. And also we need to, kind of sensitize our policy makers, not to, kind of bring it top down kind of an approach, and not to really dictate or, kind of prescribe things, that is very much happening, nowadays, to prescribe everything that what need to be done in the classroom, which is a very, very, kind of a disempowering, kind of a process. I think we need a kind of an unfolding process, and also kind of broad, guidelines, that what could be the best in terms of, moving towards this approach, and enable particularly the teachers as well as, children. We need to enable children also to understand this entire process, because unless their active participation, it may not be, kind of a one side, kind of an exercise. So therefore, in my opinion, it is more of a collective exercise, where we have to bring in the pre-service, teacher training institutions, in-service teacher training institutions, and the institutions who are responsible for handholding teacher after, once, they come into the come to the system. I think this need to be mapped very well. So we lack many a times, mapping this kind of an exercise, what exactly the role of each institutions, and how best we can really work, together to achieve the goal. I think that kind of, mapping will really help us, to move forward.
Uh, Thank you. Mr. Niranjan, I definitely resonate with your thought that it is more of an institutional level change that needs to be brought in. And, I've very closely in the past few years witnessed this at the international schools, while it's a very small speck in terms of number, but I think it's a very good example to emulate. So, at the international schools, the idea of professional development is looked at from a lifelong learning point of view. It's not about what you've learned in the past and what knowledge and degrees that you have. It's a concept of lifelong learning. So if, for example, if you're a candidate school for an IB program, it takes about 2 or 3 years for a school to get the affiliation and the authorization to run the primary or middle years program. Now, what are you doing in those 2 or 3 years? There's a lot of professional development happening, which is running in hundreds of hours. Similarly, the Australian board, the WASE curriculum, talks about making sure no matter what level of teacher you are, every year mandating about 150 hours of professional development. So, from the concept of lifelong learners is what we want to create in children. And you can never do that when you don't have lifelong learning teachers. So the professional development has to be a habit. It has to be a system in a school. Like you have a timetable for every child, what you're doing through the day and what you're doing through the week. We need to have a lot more robust where every week there are certain hours, good international schools, good Montessori's, always set out at least half a day, and some of them even set out one full day in a week for professional development. If we can't devote that time for professional development, we will not have the kind of changes we're talking about. So I think allocating a lot more time, energy, and efforts, and creating that slot in the timetable. And I've seen that work. Because most teachers today in international schools started off as state board or central board school teachers. They're very beautifully transitioned, but that transition did not happen overnight. It took a systemic effort and it also took multiple years. So I think it's a good example for us to emulate and give ourselves a few years in every school to see that transition to happen from the rote based to a competency based learning and assessment process.
Thank you so much, sir. So we have one question from Miss Leena Sharma, and she says, "How can teachers ensure fairness in competency-based assessments when students progress at different paces? Which competencies can be reliably assessed through observation and which require structured tasks? How can teachers construct rubrics that are both rigorous and student friendly?" At the same time, we have another question from from Simranjeet, who is complimenting our speakers and then asks, how to assess a student's performance who hardly speaks but otherwise is intelligent. So what I remember from when I used to learn how to teach is, there are different kind of students in the classroom. There are, I think, 7 or 9 types of learner. There are kinesthetic learner, there are audiovisual learners, etc., etc. So when a classroom is diverse, people are different kind of teaching methods suit different students, and everyone is learning at a different pace. So what does competency based assessment? It can't be uniform. It definitely can't be uniform. So how does a teacher go about that? How about those differences?
Ravina, before anybody answers, I think given that we have teachers and educators in this call, I really want to take the opportunity to debunk the learning styles myth. They aren't different kinds of learners. It's just that when learning happens through different modes of input, whether it is audio, visual, and kinesthetic, these are all different modes of learning. But now research has very powerfully debunked the idea that one particular student has a particular predominant learning style. This was a myth that came up in the early 2000s, but now it's debunked, and we should we should not propagate it any further. Uh, your question on how can we assess students who are at different learning levels, I think the fundamental thing where if you look at the CBSE and other boards are also moving is there are two interventions that help in this regard. One is to have a very well thought through rubric of assessing skills, uh, and there are, before you assess the learning, you have to first assess whether formative assessments are doing well, because before you come to summative, if at the formative level you have given students the feedback and the inputs required, then you try to cover up the gaps in the process. Ultimately, if you've never given a student feedback on which are the areas where they're missing, and then you assess them at the summative level, uh, they will struggle, right? So having rubrics and having formative steps before summative is very helpful. And then ultimately, giving students multiple opportunities to demonstrate their learning is also important, because you can't hold students accountable for a single bad day, and you also have to account for different students learning at different pace. So like CBSE has now said that board exam will happen twice. Even at school level, if we ensure that we give students multiple opportunities to demonstrate their learning and not just one assessment, those are a couple of interventions which I have seen work. I would love for my fellow panelists to suggest other ideas, so that we really can help different students who are at different levels and different stages of learning actually progress through the competence-based assessment approach.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Uh,
uh,
I just want to bring in, like basically, of course, I'm sorry, I'm bringing the Right to Education Act time and again. One of the very, important thing under the Right to Education Act, first time in the history of education in India, we have defined very clearly the roles and responsibilities of teachers. One of the important responsibilities that is listed under Section 24 of the Right to Education Act is the continuous assessment process by the teacher, and accordingly supplement whatever that additional kind of learning or teaching process that is required becomes very, very important. Like particularly if you look at, of course, now the kind of understanding, if you take 100 children, five may be very intelligent or five may be little kind of slow in learning process, but otherwise 90% of the children are capable of kind of learning things and particularly achieving whatever that we define. So therefore, see, for us, how do we really empower teachers to kind of follow multi-pronged approach, not a single kind of teaching learning method or process. In fact, when I was in the law school, I did an exercise of bringing all teachers together. Of course, at that time, already the Karnataka, state board schools were employing the competency assessed, competency-based teaching process. When I brought them together, it is not really exaggeration that teachers were able to, able to identify for every competencies more than 10 to 15 way of teaching the same competency, and also assessing the same competency in different ways. I think probably this kind of a diversified approach, and empowering teachers to adopt that kind of an approach in the classroom becomes very, very crucial. I think how do we really bring that kind of capacity, as already mentioned by my co-panelists? I think it's a continuous process. It's a continuous process. It is a process that where we need to handhold them, and we need to kind of regularly, instead of monitoring, I say it's more of facilitation. So we should do that. Once if we keep doing this, I think probably our teachers will be more empowered and more kind of able to adopt various methods that suits interest of diversified kind of categories of children. So therefore, finally it boils down to how do we really empower our teachers, this continuous professional development. And like basically for me, competency based teaching is not just kind of different thing in different schools, because for me education is not just an opportunity but also equity in education. Probably what I have been kind of advocating for more than 20 to 30 years, it's not just kind of talking about the competency based. Is it possible to bring equity in Indian education system irrespective of boards, right from IB to whatever the state boards? I think if you are able to identify the competencies as defined in the rules, like class wise, subject wise, I think that will help us more in terms of moving towards kind of this approach, and also to bring equity and social justice in the entire education system, which is otherwise missing today.
I quickly want to add a couple of points to respond to Lina's question. How can teachers ensure fairness? If you're going to compare one child with another, you will never be fair. Even a mother of two children actually knows that you don't compare the two. Unfortunately, we have an education system and a mindset that you have to compare one with the other. I think allowing children to be at different levels of learning and development is a beautiful thing. But unfortunately, you can't do that because of the numbers that we have. And there are enough and more technology and AI tools that are available today. And I want to highlight this point. One of the challenges of teachers today is a lot of administrative and academic, non-academic and non-class related work. And as long as we keep technology out, a lot of times, anytime I talk about technology, people think using a screen for a child. You know, there are multiple ways that we can bring in tech to make and reduce the burden of a teacher. And when you do that, there's a lot more time for the teacher. So technology allows a teacher to independently, monitor every child's progress and address the child. And I think that's one way of doing it. And another very varied example that comes to my mind as to how do you ensure fairness is there are boards, for example, the Western Australian board, when you're doing your 12th grade exam, a student can choose 4 subjects, 5, 6, 7, 8. A student can choose as many up to 8 subjects, and then eventually the student can also choose which are the top 4 that he would want to present as his portfolio for grade 12. So there's a choice also that's given. So there are multiple examples if we look closely as to how teachers can ensure fairness.
Yeah. If I may just add three quick things. One, I think our assessments have to become low stakes, right? I don't think we have to make every assessment as critical as a board examination. In fact, board examinations also, there's been a lot of there's been a lot of advocacy on making it low stakes, giving multiple opportunities, creating on demand examinations and such things. So first things, make assessments low stakes, and then perhaps these kind of fear and anxiety that students experience for performing in assessments is also going to reduce, and the kind of anxiety teachers feel on making students perform well in assessments is also going to come down. So I think at the principal level we need to do that. And there is need for, I think, a lot of shift in not viewing as assessments as the big bad word, but looking at assessments for development and for learning of the child. There's enough and more theorizing around formative assessments, around what Sultan was talking is what we call as ipsative assessments, assessments as learning, self-assessment. So we need to invest in those sort of approaches. And when you invest in those sort of approaches, it becomes easier to bring in more fairness. So I think at the principal level, that's what we need to do. Two very quick suggestions on approaches. One, you can use a lot of graded worksheets. So when I talk about graded worksheets, it's basically trying to measure the same learning outcome, but measuring it at different levels of difficulty. Okay, so for instance, if you're asking children about if the child has read a textual material and you're asking questions, you can design a range of questions from simple to complex, and you can see which child is at which level when it comes to responding to questions based on any textual material. And you need not say that one question is has more value points over the other. It's just for you to get a lot of understanding about at what level are your children able to comprehend text, so that you can provide the kind of instructional support that is needed for them basis their comprehension abilities, right? So graded worksheets work very well in bringing about this sort of a fairness and addressing students which are of diverse aptitudes. Lastly, on rubrics, I think there's a lot of work on co-creating rubrics with students, and you will be very surprised to see that if you just ask students to perhaps do an essay and pass the essay of students to each other and ask them to grade those essay or give it some sort of marks or even give some sort of feedback, children will point out to various things about the essay which they thought were the strong points of the essay or which they thought were the weak points of those essays. Now, those ideas can become your descriptors in the rubrics. And you, as a teacher, you can perhaps have a conversation, you can scaffold your students into thinking about what we call as quality, right? Because when you're writing something, you're expecting a certain amount of quality. So your rubrics will be student friendly because they are designed by the students along with you scaffolding the process. And they'll be rigorous because they'll be based on actual evidences of student learning, right? Now, of course, these things can't be done in isolation. Like my panelists have been talking about, we need collaborative spaces for teachers to come together. And I think capacity building programs, there are multiple courses, programs where a community of learners come together and design such assessments. It will be the right way to build that sort of confidence in creating these sort of competency based assessment solutions.
Only just one quick point to make, particularly what Sultan said, bringing technology as a kind of a, supportive and supplementary. But my only one thing, certainly we have to use technology, but the way that we are, kind of advocating technology now, particularly after AI, in education, for me, it is something, kind of worrisome because, see, the very purpose of education is socialization. That is the very purpose of education, because that is what Rousseau said in his Education and Democracy. That is the kind of bottom line, for us to make our children more socialized, more peaceful coexistence. These are the core values. In fact, these are the competencies in terms of how do we really kind of lead a very meaningful life in the society. So therefore, when we propose technology, I think we need to be more, kind of informed, more cautious that where exactly we use technology. Because sometimes I am afraid, because if you look at my own state, we have around 62,000 vacancies, teacher vacancies, so in such a kind of condition, if we bring in technology as a kind of uh, particularly kind of getting into teaching learning process, I'm a bit kind of skeptical about it. So therefore, I think we need to have a kind of a defined policy. How do we use technology? How much, and where do we use that? So those kind of nitty gritties also need to be there, because see, sometime I am afraid, even in National Education Policy 2020, we were almost proposing some kind of a online learning process for class 3, class 5, class 8 students if they are not able to attend mainstream education. So I think that kind of proposals in a way defeat the very purpose of education, because the foundational stage, particularly the school education, is something very decisive in the lives of students. So therefore, we need to have this kind of caution that what really the teacher how do we empower teacher more in terms of involving and getting involved in the process of teaching, and where exactly we use technology. So that kind of clarity also need to be there, while agreeing that certainly we need to use technology in the teaching learning process.
Mr. Ranjan, I have to add and completely agree with you. I was very specific to reduce the administrative burden of a teacher. We can use technology so that it frees up more time for the teacher and the human, which is the teacher, to spend more time with the child. Because if you speak to any teacher, they love what happens in the classroom. Every teacher loves being inside the classroom. What they don't enjoy is outside the classroom, the administrative tasks that they have to do,
Yeah,
which is pertaining to evaluation, tabulation, formulation of
yeah,
report
very true.
cards, and a lot of that, which is where technology can beautifully come in and does not have to be in between the human, which is the teacher, and the human, that's the student. And I completely agree with you. Students
Very
need the human touch, whereas
yeah.
technology can create more time for the human interaction in the classroom.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. Thank you so much to everyone. This was a wonderful conversation. I think at the outset, Anchal ma'am said that this is not just responsibility of teacher. We are all part of the education system in some way, and we all have to do our part. It is going to be a massive shift, and it this is, competency based education or competency based learning is how education should have ideally been, always been like that. But yeah, there is a lot that needs to be changed, and I think that I would like to just say that this was a wonderful session. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having us.
Thank,
All the
thank you
best.
very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very
Such a
much.
pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Thank you.